Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Revolutionary Kiev, with the illegal overthrow of the democratically elected government in Ukraine, the country stands at the abyss, politically, economically, and even territorially. Strongly supported by the EU and Washington, the new rulers of Maidan are seen as ideological zealots. Can they reach out to all Ukrainians, or will they divide the country even more? To CrossTalk events in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Amanda Paul, in Brussels. She is a policy analyst at the European Policy Center. We also have Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a legal writer and analyst. And in Moscow, we cross to Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst with the Voice of Russia radio station. All right, CrossTalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, if I can go to you first in London. The government was supposed to be formed today. They're postponing it. Is this an indication of what's going to come, where we don't have unity even in Kiev?
We have never had unity amongst the opposition leaders, and that's been a serious problem. They have never been able to agree which of them leads the opposition movement. And to make matters worse, we now know that two of the most important opposition leaders, Mrs. Tymoshenko and Mr. Klitschko, have ruled themselves out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to turn to our guest, Amanda, in Brussels. How do you see things playing out in Kiev right now? Because what we've seen is that the opposition is having a very hard time finding some kind of unity. How in the world, if they can't find unity during a crisis situation that we have right now, how can they reach out to the East that is watching this with a very wary eye?
Well, I would agree that historically, the opposition parties in Ukraine have found it quite difficult to cooperate with each other. But I still believe this time round we've seen a much greater degree of readiness to work together. Of course, you could say the fact that they didn't agree this interim government today would indicate divisions. But I would also say that we need to be extremely careful in choosing the personalities who are going to be representative in this government, because we don't want a government that's filled with personalities from the past. We need new faces. So I don't think we need to exaggerate the fact that it's taking a couple of extra days to put this government together.
Okay, Dmitry, it is a crisis situation here. The country is only weeks away from default, and it looks like that the Western powers that are so gleeful about the illegal overthrow of this government, they're going to be able to cough up the money to keep this economy going, because if it doesn't do that, then it's going to be a problem for everybody.
Well, first, Peter, I would like to correct you. These people are not the opposition anymore. They are in power in Kiev, de facto at least. And few people doubt that they will be in power for the next few years, because the EU and the United States were extremely quick in recognizing the legitimacy of this new leadership. Even though, as you rightly said, the deal between Yanukovych and the opposition was on the division of powers, not on handing power over to these people. And it's a scandal that the three foreign ministers of big EU countries, France, Germany, and Poland, they guaranteed this so-called deal, which was not worth the paper that it was written on. And none of these ministers, this is an even greater scandal, none of these ministers, all of them appear to be untroubled by this new development. It looks like the EU and the United States may pressure the IMF to give money to Ukraine this time, not to give money, of course, but to lend money. Before, under Mr. Yanukovych, the IMF's conditions were very tough. Ukraine was supposed to hike the prices for electricity and for gas for the population. It was also supposed to privatize most of the utilities so that they could become profitable, and then they could be sold to foreign companies. We'll see if the IMF will stick to the same conditions. But I think that Ukraine's bankruptcy is in no one's interest.
Absolutely.
I think this country, Ukraine, may become bankrupt if completely irresponsible people come to power.
Okay, let me go to Alexander here, because I think this is, one of the things I find very troublesome about everything that's being played out here is that very few people in the West have any questions about legitimacy of what's going on in Kiev. And I have a lot of concerns right there, because, you could say that there was a liberal element element in Kiev that wanted to see a change, fine. But they're in bed with some pretty nasty people that have not been elected by anyone, except for some violent rioters on the Maidan.
Indeed so. Can I just say, one of the most dangerous and alarming of these people, Mr. Dmitry Yarosh, I saw today, is actually angling to be made Deputy Prime Minister in this interim government, which would be a very alarming development indeed. Now, on the question of legitimacy, let's be absolutely clear that not only was the power-sharing arrangement that Dmitry was talking about not worth the paper that it was written on, but what we have seen since Friday has been an extraordinary collapse of any kind of constitutional order. Mr. Yanukovych was removed from power without any process of impeachment. Laws have been passed at a phenomenal rate by a parliament doing completely the opposite of what it was elected to do. An acting president has been appointed, contrary to the provisions of the Constitution, and steps are being taken to outlaw, or at least to prevent or restrict, the use of Russian, which is also contrary to the Constitution. Now, to talk about legitimacy in this situation is, to my mind, extremely difficult. This is not a legitimate situation. It is a revolutionary situation in which the traditional political leaders, the people we were talking about, Klitschko, Yatsenyuk, Tymoshenko, they are not in control. The people who are in control in Kiev are entirely different people, very violent people, sometimes very extreme people, people with very alarming views, but they're the people at the moment who are in charge because they have the crowds and they have the guns.
Okay, Amanda, do you think the European Union should be in bed with some of these people from the right sector, Sloboda? I mean, anyone that takes any interest in what's going on in Ukraine will find out that these are very unsavory people with some very, very violent and really backward-looking ideas about politics.
Well, I think we have to remember how we got to this point in the first place. The reason why we're at this point, and including this economic disaster in Ukraine, is because of the bad economic and political policies of the leadership of Viktor Yanukovych and all of those cronies that were surrounding him. I mean, he basically ran Ukraine like a fiefdom, which was only beneficial to himself.
Well,
and
Amanda,
those close
I
to
don't
him,
think
the
anybody
oligarchs.
on this program would disagree with what you're saying, but you're not answering my question.
Well, of course, there is extremist elements within this group of Euromaidan protesters. We know that, but still, the broader base of these protesters are still remaining peaceful and calm. I don't think you can define all of these people as wielding guns, because that's simply not the case. I mean, if you go out into the streets of Kiev today, we're not seeing violence all over the place. But the expectations is from Euromaidan protesters. They want to see this new interim government, when it's put in place, temporary leadership, deliver on the promises that they've made on the original demands of the people. So, of course, they are going to be, let's say, a bit skeptical given the history of Ukraine's political elites.
Dmitry, here in Moscow, I mean, can you have a transition to any kind of form of democracy defined by Washington or Brussels when it's being ruled by a mob?
Peter, I would at the same time agree and disagree with something that Amanda says. On the one hand, yes, not all of the people on Maidan were wielding guns. In the same way, in 1933, not all the people who voted for Hitler wanted Jews to be exterminated. Not all of them wanted to invade Russia or to become masters of Europe. This is the problem. You know, maybe in a few days you will have less people wielding guns. Right now, there are all of these so-called self-defense units controlling Kiev, and these self-defense units organized pillaring of a governor in Lutsk, in the west of Ukraine. In Lvov, they forced the former police officers to stand on the knees and to beg the crowd for forgiveness. You can watch it on the internet. And the so-called liberal mass media in Ukraine, like the Western-supported Ukrainska Pravda, they cherish these images. They say that this is the civilization, this is democracy, although it looks a bit medieval to me. The problem is that it's enough to read the programs of these people. I mean, read the program of Yarosh. He says that people who don't want to speak Ukrainian should be expelled from Ukraine. He says that nuclear weapons should be brought back to Ukraine. Ukraine should have nuclear status again. These views of his are shared by Oleg Tyagnybok, and we see Tyagnybok shaking hands with Catherine Ashton and with Victoria Nuland and with other people from the EU and the United States. I think the most terrible consequence of what happened in Ukraine is that the United States and the EU disqualified themselves as intermediaries. After they failed to guarantee the agreement that was signed under their auspices, how can they be trusted in future? If there is any conflict in the former Soviet Union, in Russia or in Belarus or in Armenia, and there may be a lot more conflicts, who will view the EU and the United States as arbiters, as intermediaries? This is awful. And I would say that coups are not a new thing in the former Soviet Union. They have been happening since 1991 and even before. But the problem was that before, the United States and the EU were never very quick in supporting coups. Okay, Gamsahurdia was toppled in 1991. LCB was toppled in Azerbaijan 2 hours later. Always, the United States and Europe always took a somewhat detached attitude. They waited for a few days. They never said that we're happy about what happened. And here, they guaranteed
all right, Dima, I'm going to have to jump in here, folks. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent developments in Ukraine. Okay, Amanda, I'd like to go back to you in Brussels. There's an old saying, if you break it, you own it. And since the EU has been so been involved in the recent events, even I would call a coup, illegal coup in Kiev, isn't it now responsible for what happens in Kiev right now? Being, people talking about giving it loans and all of that. I mean, it's really quite interesting, isn't it, that, the people of Greece and Cyprus probably find this really quite odd that the European Union is so interested in involving itself in the affairs of Ukraine.
Well, I don't find it odd whatsoever. I mean, Ukraine has been for a long time a key partner of the EU. It's a very important state, a transit state between Russia and the EU. So I don't find it strange at all. And of course, what we've seen out in the streets of Ukraine for the past 3 months has made it very clear. The people on Euromaidan have been looking to Europe, looking west for support and assistance from the EU to help them democratize and modernize their country. I think the EU actually has a responsibility to support the Ukrainian people, to increase security and stability on the European continent, which is exactly what the EU was created for. And I believe, in fact, the EU actually has been too slow in reacting to what happened in Ukraine. Perhaps if they'd gone in earlier with a more robust policy, we perhaps might not have seen so many deaths. I think the EU is correct to try and help Ukraine financially. And this financial problem
Amanda,
in Ukraine,
well, how could they have been how could they be more proactive than they have been? Okay, my goodness. Okay, what business is it of the European Union to determine what political environment there is in Kiev? Alexander, if I can go to you in London, I mean, it seems to me, and I'll be very blunt here, this is just kind of a very imperialistic attitude that it knows better for other people. I do not see any scenario right now that there's a good outcome for Ukraine over the next few months, next few years. I mean, the country is going into bankruptcy, and who's going to pay for it? Is it the European Union going to pay for it now? I doubt it. Go ahead.
Well, I entirely agree. Can I just say something, which is this? Mr. Yanukovych, we are all agreed, was an awful leader. He was due to face an election in March 2022. 2015, which he would surely have lost. If he had lost that election, if that election had happened in a normal way, whoever would have taken over in a democratic way with a constitution and a government that worked. What we have now, because of the way in which he was overthrown, is an utterly chaotic and fragmented situation in which everything is falling apart. And that is precisely because of the wholly illegitimate way in which this was done, preempting the result of a democratic election. Now, it was not in the EU's interests, it seems to me, for that to happen. And if we have an economic crisis on our hands, which is going to be far worse than it would have been had we had a functioning government in Kiev working within a proper constitutional system.
Okay.
And if the EU has to pay the bill of that, well, what is the surprise?
Okay. Dima, it seems to me, remembering Victoria Nuland's leaked conversation, everything is going to plan because the EU in Washington want to have their people in charge in Kiev. They don't want elections there. They don't want a democracy there because they won't be able to choose who's in power. They're doing it right now as we speak.
Well, I would play a devil's advocate here for some time. Speaking about Mr. Yanukovych, I think that he was corrupt and ineffectual, but he had one good thing about him. He looked for a compromise. Not only he offered the position of the prime minister, he also offered the EU several ways out of the crisis before the Vilnius summit. He actually didn't cancel this ill-fated association agreement with the EU. He just postponed it. And he suggested trilateral negotiations between the EU, Moscow, and Kiev to iron out the differences on the trade policies. And the answer from Brussels was no. We won't have trilateral negotiations. We're only going to talk to you. So the EU, indeed, its role in Kiev was extremely negative. I would like to hear what Amanda would respond to me, when she says that the EU got involved too early. Well, I think that the involvement of the EU was wholly negative, because even now, the things that are coming from the EU, like warnings, Elmar Brok, the chairman of the European Parliament's committee, he came to Ukraine today and he said that Ukrainians should stop witch hunt because this may provoke Russia's intervention. There are no signs of Russia's intervention. There was not a single statement by the Russian leaders that would make it look possible. There were no intercepted conversations, nothing. But still, the EU frightening Ukrainians by this scarecrow of a Russian intervention created this terrible atmosphere of witch hunt. So I think that Elmar Brok is the last man qualified to stop the witch hunt because he believed in the witches. How can you stop the witch hunt if you believe in the witches?
Okay, Amanda, do you want to reply to what Dima Babich just had to say here?
First of all, of course, Elmar Brok, he doesn't represent the EU. His comments are wholly unhelpful, of course, but he is not representing the EU. He's not a leader of a member state or an EU official. And I just want to return to the point that was raised earlier about how we should have waited until the presidential elections next year. Quite frankly, I don't think there's any doubt that these elections were not likely to have been free and fair. The last parliamentary elections in Ukraine, we know that they were far from being free and fair. This was widely reported. So quite frankly, the chances of presidential elections being free and fair was not very likely. Mr. Yanukovych's rule, we saw democracy going downhill very quickly in Ukraine on every single level.
Why is it the European Union's mission to save democracy in Ukraine? Can you answer that question to me? Why is it your responsibility?
Let's look at it from the other way. It's not the European Union that is the demander here. It's Ukraine that has demanded from the European Union for many years a closer relationship, both politically and economically. The European Union does not go around looking for countries to save. The request came from Ukrainian political elites, from civil society, from society as a whole. They want to have this engagement with the EU. They want to have the relationship. But what we have seen,
Well,
I'm sorry, from President Yanukovych and his government,
one of the big problems here is that it is a divided country. It's a divided country. Alexander, can you address that here? Because, again, you know, we have these differences in East and West, and what's happening in Kiev right now is giving plenty of people good reason to say, hey, if you want Kiev, you want Maidan, you can have it. Because a lot of people are dissatisfied with the kind of political slogans and ideology that is spewing out from Kiev right now, and they don't want to have anything to do with it.
Well, exactly, because, of course, from the point of view of the people in the eastern Ukraine, this is the third time that a government they elected has been overthrown. It happened in 2004, it happened in 2007, and it's happened again. And not only has it happened this time, but we're seeing people like Mr. Yarosh, whom we talked about before, and others like him, speaking in the most extraordinary way and talking in a most repressive way. And not just about Russians, by the way, but about Jews. The chief rabbi of the Ukraine has said the Jews are no longer safe there. Now, when that happens, of course, people in the east and the south of the Ukraine who do not share the views of some of the people on Maidan are concerned. And of course, that accelerates a process of fragmentation in a situation where the constitution is no longer working, which it isn't at the moment. I think, Amanda speaks about democratic elections not happening in 2015. We never got there. We never found out. Up to a few months ago, the EU was dealing with Mr. Yanukovych as the democratically elected president of the Ukraine. They were dealing with the parliament as the democratically elected parliament of the Ukraine. Now, we're told that in 2015 that might not have been the case. And as a result of that, we have total chaos in Kiev now, repression all over the place, men with guns, and, I am amazed by this denial that there still is on this question when the facts on the ground speak overwhelmingly for themselves, and people in the south and east, for the first time, seriously talking about secession.
Dima, here in Moscow, how do you see that the issue of secession? Because it's always been there. There've been people, even people in the Crimea, looking for an opportunity like this because they don't like the rule from Kiev. How is this going to play out? Because I know there's a lot of tensions here. There's a lot of tempers flaring. What's going on in the east and south?
I don't believe that Ukraine will split. Of course, what's going on, there's a lot of injustice. But people in the east and in the south of Ukraine, they lived under the Soviet Union. They were formed under the Soviet Union. So they have a lot of good things, that they inherited from the Soviet Union. They also have some bad ones. And the bad one is to always look up to the authority, to look up to Kiev, to fulfill the orders, even though these orders are now coming from possibly the people who are like Mr. Yarosh. I think it's a scandal that Mr. Yarosh, who holds openly anti-Semitic views, is going to become a deputy prime minister of Ukraine. I think it's a scandal that Mr. Tyagnybok is meeting European leaders. That's for the first time since, I think, 1939 we have this situation. I was sorry that Amanda could not finish. I think I can follow in her thinking. When you say that elections were criticized by the media, so that means that the next election is going to be unfair, I don't know. Then it's very easy to invalidate any election in the world. I'm a journalist. I worked with Western journalists. I know how easily they report about breaches of electoral processes in other countries, not in their own.
I meant international organizations.
Folks, I'm really sorry. I really wish we had more time, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Brussels, London, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.